Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to BB Harriers AC Live. It's Nick Corrie here, President of Blackheath and Bromley. And our guest this evening is Life member Frank Dick. And I can see Frank is just getting into the feed. Good evening, Frank. How are you?
Pretty good, and you?
I'm really well. I'm really pleased to see you. How's things treating you? How's the lockdown going?
Well, pretty good. I mean, we live right in the middle of the country here, so being isolated was really not much different than usual.
I know that we were thinking about getting you on last weekend, but it was Father's Day. Did you manage to catch up with the family?
Yes, it did, actually. And also, it was because of lockdown, we haven't seen our little grandson very much over the last year. And he's going to be 1 on Thursday. So we did manage to catch up with him over Father's Day. So that was quite cool.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, fantastic. That's really terrific. Well, great to see you in fine fettle. Frank, I can see there's lots of people joining the feed, which is terrific. You're quite a drawer, of course. I wanted to ask, I mean, you and I have known each other probably for about a year or so. I don't know you so well, and I obviously know some of the headlines. But I really wanted to get into, you know, what drew you into the sport of athletics. How did that first come about?
Well, I suppose really back to school days, on a particular school sports day in the under 16 age group. I've got third place in the half mile and third place in the triple jump. And I was kind of hooked at that point because I hadn't been particularly good at any other sport at that point. And this was a chance for me to make my name. So I pestered the life out of the PE teacher to get myself onto the Scottish Schoolboys Easter course. And eventually managed to get onto that. And I can still remember the moment I went into Inverclyde National Recreation Centre and looked up. And this giant of a guy called Tony Chapman, who was the second ever national coach in any sport behind Jeff Dyson. He walked down the stairs. And this guy to me was like a god, a fount of all wisdom. I was desperate to know as much as I could about athletics. And it seemed to me at that point that the best way to be that, to know all of that stuff was to be a coach. And so that was it. And that kind of came into my brain and went out of my brain because then I got into athletics itself. I suppose my only two reasonable achievements were a 3A's junior title in the 200 yards hurdles at that time, and one indoor competition for Great Britain. That's all. So, I mean, when I went on to coach, I was working with people who were far, far greater achievers than I ever was. But I think because I had to work so hard to learn, it gave me a great foundation to be a coach. So on leaving school, I wasn't particularly bright. I'd failed, hadn't done too well in my leaving certificate, but I managed to get a back door into Edinburgh University so I could study maths, but not sit the exams, which was fine for me.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and a guy called Bob Hay, who was the guy, incidentally, who went on to be the first person to do operations on a baby who had cleft palate. Right. You know, because up to that point you waited for somebody to be older. But anyway, he got me in. We went to Loughborough for the UAU Championship, which was kind of a former version of the British universities. And I finished second in a half mile there. And Robbie Brightwell happened to be there at the same time. And it was through, Robbie said, "Why don't you come to Loughborough?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know a Scottish boy could come to an English institution." And I couldn't swim. That was a real, and you needed to be able to swim to be a PE teacher. So Robbie said, "Look, all you have to do is keep Baz Stamatakis, who was the head of physical education, keep him talking long enough, and you'll run out of time, and he won't be able to test you for swimming." Which is what I did, and I got in without being able to swim, which caused a bit of a nightmare on the first tests when we got in there, but that's another story. So once in, I was working with a guy called Jeff Gowan, who was my coach at that point, learned huge amounts from him. And I was desperate to know more and more about coaching.
I want to just interject one thing quickly, Frank, because we have a number of athletes now that are at Loughborough And I know, you know, Seb Coe is very involved with Loughborough too, but we had Kelechi Gotcha last week, was on this show. He's a very talented high jumper, second in English schools last year. We've had Bailey Stickins, also as a 400-metre hurdler, Southern champion. He was at Loughborough. The Loughborough that you went to back then, did it have that kind of sports reputation then? Because clearly now, obviously, it's a place that people strive and want to get to because of the fantastic sporting opportunities.
Well, remember at that point, it wasn't Loughborough University. It was Loughborough College of Physical Education. And but it still had that kind of reputation. I mean, I won't run through all the various names that went through at that particular point, but you did have people like John Cooper, that tragically died in the Paris air disaster. Loads of them. One of the great competitions, even now, of course, was Loughborough past and present versus the 3A's competition. And really, the Loughborough team was a British national team against the 3A's at that point. So anyway, to finish my story, I left. I finished at Loughborough. Started to teach at Worksop College, Jack Buckner's old stamping ground, and I got restless because having left Loughborough at that point, we didn't have degrees, but the year who'd just come in were going to have degrees in physical education. So we thought we'd better sort that out. And a pal of mine, Bill Pink, and I went off to study at the feet of Bill Bowerman at the University of Oregon. Now, I don't know if you know that side of the sport, Bill Bowerman, but he was an amazing coach. I worshipped everything that this guy said. And he had a postgraduate business studies student at Loughborough, at Oregon, called Phil Knight. And these two guys together formed a company. Do you know what it is? Nike.
Right. I do. Okay. Fantastic.
Bill was fed up with the way people were making running shoes at that point for road running, and he created his own called the Waffle Sole shoes. And so, yeah, that was it. Came back home, and I was going to go back to Oregon again, but I was offered a fellowship to study at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Went up to say goodbye to my mum and dad. But who should I bump into in Lothian Road, just off Princess Street? And but Tony Chapman, that very coach that I saw when I was a kid. And he said, "Oh, did you know that John Anderson has resigned?" I said, because he was national coach in Scotland. I said, "No, I hadn't." He said, "Well, look, why don't you apply for the job?" And I said, "No, really, no. I've made my mind up. I've come up to say goodbye to my mum and dad. I'm going to Canada, and that's it." He said, "Look, why don't you apply for a laugh?" So I did. And they offered me the job, and
that's amazing, Frank. But I mean, come on. I mean, to go straight to national coach, you must have been achieving something to get that to be noticed like that.
Well, as I was trying to say, I was really quite a student of coaching and on teaching and the sport at that point. And the interesting thing is, and I hope this will give heart to a lot of people out there, is that I had no coaching qualification at that point. None at all. And my boss at that point said, we'll wait for you for as long as it takes you to get your award. So I went down to England. I did the 3A's senior coaching award paper, and then went to Loughborough of all places. Wilf Page took me on my practical, and I got passed, and that was it. That was the start of me in national coaching. Then subsequently, some years later, after the bit of a disastrous Olympic Games that we had in Montreal, one bronze medal, and the Kenyans weren't even there, and Brendan Foster brought the bronze medal. Came back home. They had this big thing called the Wembley Convention, when they decided to do a serious review of coaching. And I was asked at that point if I'd have a look at coach education. And out of that, we actually had our first serious, I think, step forward in coach education in UK athletics. But the next year, the principal national coaches were I think John Lamaze left first, then Dennis Watt second, and they were decided we were going to appoint a director of coaching. Well, I didn't apply. Harry Wilson came up to Scotland and phoned me up and said, "Would you like to have dinner with me through in Glasgow?" So I met. They said, "Why haven't you applied for this job?" I said, "Well, to be absolutely honest, I'm really quite happy up here in Scotland. I mean, but by that time I'd had most of the committees. I could manipulate anything I wanted through most of the committees." And he said, "Well, how would you like it then if a coach came in and told you what to do in Scotland?" I said, "Well, that wouldn't be very fair." He said, "Well, it's up to you, Frank." So I applied and I got the job. And after that, everything's history.
It's a tremendous start to the story, and it really puts a great context because obviously you've been involved in coaching ever since. And I know that I can see that there's a lot of people joining the feed. John Blackie is on the feed.
Hey, John.
Ian Dibbins is on the feed. Paul Ostrich is on the feed. I'm sure there's a few others. There's, a lot of the Blackheath coaches that have come to listen, which is great. And that they do such great work for us. And obviously it's been very tough for them, during the lockdown, keeping their athletes motivated. And I really want to thank them because they have done a great job for the club and continue to do so. Can I ask you, Frank, what do you think that, coaching as it is, I don't mean right now because I think lockdown's slightly different, but let's forget about COVID. Let's just go to modern coaching as opposed to the coaching that you came into, a few years ago. What do you think has changed for the better? What do you think is really fundamental and just has always been, good, solid coaching, techniques and advice for athletes? If you can answer that.
Oh, pretty complicated old question there.
It is a complicated one.
Right. Well, first of all, to finish my previous story, I was really, really fortunate, Nick, in having some wonderful athletes and some fantastic coaches around at that time. And if I could say now, one of my greatest sense of fulfillment, if you like, as a head coach, was that when just before I left, my last Olympic Games was '92, coaching that British team, and I think there were over 90 athletes in the team. There were over 60 coaches responsible for that team. And that meant that was wonderful to me because it meant that we'd created something in British athletics that had 60, can you imagine that? 60 coaches were at the level where they could put athletes into an Olympic Games. And one of the things that I think kind of went wrong after that was the concept of centralizing coaching rather than decentralizing, which is what it was. And okay, I'm not saying for a moment it was perfect, but I always took my role and the role of national coaches at that point as their function was to provide the support that personal coaches needed to do their job properly, rather than try to pull them in, because I think centralizing actually crushes creativity. If you think about some of the wonderful things that were happening at that time, again, nothing to do with me, it was just I landed at the right moment at the right time. We had, at one point, going to Moscow, we had 5 athletes, can you imagine this? 5 athletes in the top 10 in the world in 1500 meters. The top 3 were ours, Seb, Steve, and Steve. David Moorcroft was 5th or 6th, and Frank Clements was 9th or 10th. So what was great about that? They were coached by different people. What you mustn't do is pull things into the center because you crush the competitiveness that you need amongst coaches. You need competition amongst the coaches so that they challenge each other's thinking, and the whole level of coaching goes up at that point. So I'm kind of trying to answer 2 things at the same time here, take you to where I'd got to with British athletics at that point, but also come up to date. Are there some problems out there? Well, first of all, I hope without offending too many people, I do not believe that coach education is actually in the right pitch to prepare coaches all the way through to be elite coaches. Sticking with that for a moment, however, I think we still are in danger of having coach development in parallel with athlete development. You see, if you look at the way coaching systems are structured, we find ourselves with beginner coaches working with beginner athletes. Now that's fatal. It's absolutely fatal for the long term. But why does that happen? Well, because people always, they're encouraged to aspire to moving up. So they're working with the high performance end. But we must understand that just as in education, you need somebody who's world class working with infants, and then the next level, and so on. It's far better to see coach development almost at right angles to the athlete development, so that one day you can become a world-class coach to beginners, or world-class coach to developers, or a world-class coach to high performers. But even at that level, there are variations that I wouldn't have thought about before, but because of the work I do across different sports and with world athletics at the moment, I see a slightly different picture now. So just to revise, we should have people having a career as a coach to beginners or developers or elite performers. That's not to say that people can't move up or down. That's absolutely up to them. But we must have a parity of esteem. It's an old education expression. A parity of esteem. People who coach beginners are just as valuable as people who are coaching Olympic medalists. And until such time as we get that into our heads in coaching, we'll have this kind of dissonance in how we progress people. But let me come back to these coaches to beginners now. In a former time, we trusted school physical education to make sure that that kids had a physical education background before they ever came to us as coaches in sport. But you can't count on that anymore. Physical education has taken a few body blows over the years. And so I now see the importance of our coaches coaching beginners as not only to give them a starting point to go in that journey themselves, athletes to going on towards high performers, but as you and I speak, the children in primary schools today are destined to live 5 years less than their parents. Now that hasn't happened in history before. Why is it? Through inactivity, in the name of progress. Look at what we're doing now, having this conversation here. Everything is channeled into doing nothing. You know, because we don't want kids to be have an unsafe journey to school. We'll drive them to school. Watching computers takes a big chunk of a young person's time now. Oh, by the way, it's too dangerous to climb trees and so on. And because of all of that, children, for the most part, have become less active. So it seems to me that whoever works with beginner athletes either prepares them to do a journey in our sport, or prepares them to have an attitude that will lead to an active life plan, and they'll look after themselves. For one other fracture to the notion of coach education is, and it's this can I pass on experience here from another sport altogether. I'm very flattered to have had the chance to work with Eddie Jones and the England rugby coaches. And what I got a hold of very early in working in that environment was that just because a player is a strong enough professional to be a top premiership player doesn't mean to say that they're the right person for international rugby and playing test rugby. It's like this. If you think of a youngster coming in and they're a Fiat 500, right? And their aspiration in life is to be a Fiat Testarossa. There's no connection between not a big connection between a Fiat Testarossa and a Formula One car. If you're going to if you're wanting our athletes to be a Dina Asher Smith, who, with no disrespect, John, but I see her as a a Ferrari Formula One car, right? She's not a Testarossa. She's a Formula One, and in order for her to be successful as a Formula One, she needs a Formula One kind of coach working with her. And so, in coach education and athlete support at the top end, we need to seriously shake up our coach education program and make sure that we're preparing people for these different roles. I hope that's not been a too lengthy a response, but that.
No, I mean, I think it's really fascinating, Frank, and it's so important because, of course, you know, as a club, and I don't think Blackheath and Bromley are very different from many others. We are, you know, very much reliant on volunteers and people who give their time. I think we're so fortunate as a club because the access to competition that our young athletes get is incredible, actually, because when you join the club as an under 13, you're already on that YDL program, and you really have the benefit of such a strong experienced coaching setup around you and some fantastic youngsters around you as well. So the competition is rife. So, you know, invariably, we as a club do get to the national final. You know, that happens in the upper age group too. So that they are on that journey already, which is really terrific. But I do think that as well, you know, we are reliant on, you know, volunteers. People have their interests, their aspirations. And, you know, what I'm taking away from you is that I don't know if I can apply the lessons that you've got at the national level to what we're doing in a large club. But, you know, it does sound like that kind of competition between coaches is a healthy thing for the athletes as well.
Well,
so it's trying to take some of those learnings and ingredients. And that's a question, really. Do you think, as you know, thinking about Blackheath and Bromley as a club, and I know there'll be people watching from other big clubs like Shaftesbury and Reading and so on and so forth, you know, can you take those learnings into a club for coaching?
Yes, yes, of course. I mean, the principles of coaching are the same across sports, whether you're working with beginners, working with elite. If I can come back a few squares, I simply want coaches to understand that their role is important for whoever they're coaching, because you're actually part of an athlete's journey. I know this will probably sound like a typical Frank Dick throwaway line, but when I first had a serious set of conversations with IAAF at that point, and the concept of a world academy for athletics coaching, I was trying to say to them that I wasn't convinced that the sport as a whole truly values coaches. And so I came up with this line. I said, you know, athletes make excellence happen. Coaches make excellence possible. And as a consequence, they are gold dust to the sport at whatever level they work. And their aspiration, I think, whatever the role, it's not a million miles this from Martin Luther King's line. If you're going to be a street sweeper, street sweeps like Michelangelo painted paintings. Whatever your role in any culture, whether you're working with beginners, whether you're your team of people who run administration in the club, collecting subscriptions, being there to open gates, to run the club, to handle the management, to organize the food, to deal with the travel. Every single person is there for a purpose. They are gold dust, and we have to value them as a team. Unfortunately, in track and field athletics, we are mostly very individual. We don't think normally. Okay, our club, of course, is very much a sense of community and family, but for the most part, in our sport, we think individually. what I'd like to think of us as we move forward is, this will sound like I invented this word, but I didn't. It's actually the topic of a book. It's called co-opetition. Even if we compete with each other in the summer, why can't we cooperate with each other in the winter? Why can't we work together as coaches, share our learning? Because I know we're going to compete with each other later, but if we're going to make coaching grow, if we're going to grow ourselves, then you have to share information. You know, there's a great line from Ari de Hughes: probably the only sustainable competitive advantage we have is the ability to learn faster than the opposition. Now, I don't believe anybody would argue with that. So here's the no-brain question. Do you think you can learn faster on your own, or by learning together with other people and sharing experience?
No doubt with others, no doubt with and from others, no doubt.
And so, and I think, well, let me go back in history. I just arrived in Scotland. There are two athletics clubs up there, women's athletics clubs. One's called Mary Hill Harriers, and the other one in Glasgow, and in Edinburgh Southern Harriers Ladies. Now, they're the two coaches, Jimmy Campbell in Glasgow and George Sinclair in Edinburgh. Their big ambitions really were to knock spots of each other, so to see who got the most medals at the Scottish Women's Championships. And the best of them would go down and compete with the women's 3As at that point, and some of them would get into the British team. Well, at that point, I think less than 10% of the British team, about 7.5 to 10%, were coming from Scotland. And I got the two coaches together and said, listen, this idea of co-opetition, if you work together over the winter months and swap knowledge with each other, the results might still be the same when we have the Scottish National Championships, but you'll actually be performing at a different level. Because this is, and I know we've spoken about this before, Nick, it's about performance. You know, how do our kids come into the sport with personal bests? You know, and trying to be better today than you were yesterday, every day. That's our definition of winning when we start off with our kids. And one day, of course, there can be one and onlys, like Adina or whatever, right? But we start off with the notion that performance is the thing that matters. And if you think about it, if you focus on your performance, forget the result, focus on your performance. If you take care of performance, the result will look after itself in time. Okay, you keep on working on this. That's the only thing you can influence. You cannot influence the result completely because other people are trying to get it. You can only influence your own performance, and that should be our focus. And coming back to the example I was giving you, so they changed. They did work together, and within 3 years, they had, I think it was 20% of the British team. Right? Why? Simply by understanding. Listen, we can't know everything, each one of us, but we can know an awful lot more by swapping intelligence. And I think I hope that's a good message for my club out there. I should say this to get this off my chest. Are you aware that since I left my position as the director of coaching, the only club in the United Kingdom who's spoken to me is ours?
I'm shocked and horrified, but secretly quite pleased.
And how many times do you think the new body of the UK Athletics, how many times do you think they've invited me to a competition to watch? The only organisation where southern counties invited me to come and watch the Southern Championships since I left the sport.
I wouldn't have enough fingers on my hands. I'm sure it's just millions of times.
No, once. Only southern counties.
I'm shocked. I'm absolutely shocked.
Because that's where we're an individual sport, and we don't actually think in the main of us all being in a family, and I think that's a shame.
Well, Frank, I can tell you that I'm personally, as president and as the YDL junior men's team manager, when we're next at the final, I'm inviting you to come up to.
Yes.
Well, we'll see where it is, because obviously we've got to see. It's going to be next season, but hopefully we'll get there. I'll definitely have you invited for the trip. You can motivate the athletes on the night before, which would be sensational.
Very happy to do that. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, just before because we've spent a lot of time on athletics, and you did mention your work with rugby as well, rugby union. I'm obviously very passionate about rugby league. We've got a World Cup coming up, so I must plug that as well. But tell us about, because we think of athletics as a very individual sport. And Blackheath is very lucky because we're in a number of competitions that do have a team structure, so that cohesion is very, very good at the sort of point scoring level. But how is it different working with a team structured sport than an individualistic structured sport, if that's how you consider athletics would be?
Well, on the one hand, you're dealing with individuals because you have to know your people, whatever your organization in life. You really have to know your people individually. And one of the things that I found really quite fascinating was a willingness in any training camp or whatever to share information about experiences with different players, because we're not all motivated by the same thing. For example, we've each got our own stress signatures in life, for example. And if we don't take time to really know the individual, although they're part of a team, then you're not going to be able to give them the right diet of work. Much of that is not just about how you learn about people in training and competition, but over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or something, and somebody might say, well, yes, I'm having this little bit of trouble at home, or I had an accident last week, or my goodness, the economics are not looking good. And anything like that, little messages that come in, they're not just important to you having the conversation with the player, they're important for all of us, because we're all going to have these moments with individual players. And you should know as much as you can about them, even if it's brought from other people. And I think that notion of working together, almost corporately, to make sure that you're doing the right thing for individuals so that they can work more effectively together, I think that's a big thing. But one other thing that I learned when I came back, I went into South Africa. You'll probably recall. For a couple of years leading into the 2016 Olympic Games. And that got me face-to-face with athletes, but more importantly, face-to-face with coaches, and watching what they were doing at that point. And in South Africa, it was still very, very much a world that I knew of, very much a people business. That there are two things going on when you're coaching athletes. There's a technical business and a people business. You've got to be pretty hot in your technical stuff, otherwise don't get into coaching. But if you're not hot in your people business, you can forget it. It's just not going to work at all. So let's come back home then. And now I'm watching different sports, not just rugby, watching different sports, and I'm watching coaches in action. And one of the things that occurred to me very early on was that whereas I belong to a world where you'd intervene, step forward and do a bit of coaching, coaching in the moment, I call that, I didn't see much of that, or not as much as I thought I expected to. And then I began to wonder, well, what's happening here? Because that session I'm watching, that's really a brilliant session. I would never have the brains to work out the detail of that stuff in there, really brilliant stuff. But the coach is watching. And so my first thought was that they're not seeing things that need to be addressed, which would put a question against observation skills. I don't know if our coaches in the club and around the country, I don't know if they're aware of a simple model of decision making that comes from the United States military, as supersonic fighters, by the way. They came out with the idea of the OODA loop: observe, orientate, decide, act. Now, observation is about looking at things but seeing things, listening for things but hearing things. And if your observation skills are not sharp, then there's no point to go to the orientation, the contextual side of things, because you've not got the right intelligence coming in. Now, I wonder if that's what's happening here. Then it dawned on me what was happening. You've got a drone up here, you've got 360-degree cameras, you've got GPS in the back, you've got software tuning all of these things together. And the coaches would wait till after the event when they can see all the data, what was right, wrong, what worked, what didn't work, and then try to put it back into the athlete later. Too late, Nick. And I just sometimes wonder if we're not careful here, we can allow technology to try to make our decisions for us. But technology is there to inform our decision making. It's not to make our decisions for us. And what I don't want us to fall into the trap of is to become so reliant on this objectivity, this wonderful data that we're getting across here, that we actually neglect our people skills and the critical skills that we need. So, okay, I'm a dinosaur. I get that, right? I really get that.
No, I don't think you are, because that what you said there has so much application, beyond sport actually. And as you know, I used to work in the financial markets, and I was a trader. And what you've said there, I mean, I've seen the improvement in technology and modeling and so on and so forth over the years. But you know that if there's a market crash situation, if you're sat there trying to be reliant on models, you're finished. That's when you revert back to your trader true skill to fight your way out of these absolutely, terrible market conditions. And you have to make some pretty difficult decisions that probably wouldn't make sense if you just followed the model. But as an experienced trader, that if you keep following the model, that this is going to turn into a complete catastrophe. And I can really see that resonates with me from what you're saying about sport.
Yeah, and I just think that if we're not careful, then we can begin coach education programs, and this coming back to that again, be very careful that we don't become so reliant on technology that we neglect that side. Now, why do we think it's happened? Well, if you look at some of the societal changes that have happened, there's almost a sense of demand for objectivity, transparency. We don't want too much subjectivity coming in here, for goodness sake. What? Have an opinion? Don't dare do that. It's got to be evidence-based. But the fact is that the majority of our calls out there are not evidence-based. They are judgment-based. We learn in life over time. We learn how to pick up stuff from experience, and it begins to be the framework against which we make judgment calls. For example, can you imagine Alex Ferguson waiting for the scientific evidence before he makes this or that decision at the side of the pitch? Absolutely. And I just think we've got to get smarter than that. There are some things in life, Nick, you can be taught. There are other things in life you can only learn. We can be taught the science of coaching, the tools of the trade, the teaching methods, the 7 teaching methods, the laws of training. We can be taught all of that. In fact, look at what we're doing right here. The virtual education, e-education, or on the screen and so on, that I think leans towards that side of things and is a very efficient way. It can be because it can come into our own homes and so on. So I can see that in teaching us the tools of the trade. But when it comes to what we can learn, you learn the art of coaching through life experience and coaching experience. And the problem, of course, with experience, as Vernon Law said, is that experience is the cruelest of all teachers because she gives you the test first and the lesson second.
Oh, fantastic.
But I don't think we should hide from that, Nick. I think the fact is, I'll put my hands up now, I made so many mistakes in coaching. I remember Ron Murray, the high jump coach, taking him to one side when I was now the director of coaching, and saying to me, Frank, you'll make more mistakes. You'll break more athletes to begin with than you'll make. And I thought, well, how can I possibly do that? But the fact is, as coaches, we've got to learn through experience, just as we expect athletes to learn through experience. But if you're going to do that, mandatorily, make sure you've got a mentor or a fellow coach whose wisdom and judgment you trust, that after you've gone through an experience, after an Olympic Games, after junior championships, after your very first indoor meeting and so on, get a hold of somebody and sit down and have the courage to be vulnerable and admit that we can't know everything in life. I've met coaches, I'm sure they're not around now, who would make athletes the victim of their limitations. And I think that's a crime. I think we have a chance. Be vulnerable. Put your hand up. We all make mistakes. If you're going to take risks in life, which you have to do, you'll make mistakes. If there's no mistakes, there's no risks. If there's no risks, there's no progress. We've got to have the courage to do that. And if we're, for example, in the club here, if we're truly going to work together to be great in the future, let's have serious debriefs after we've gone to championships, after we've had a club competition or whatever, and say, right, what did we learn from this? Each one of us, is there a coaching lesson that we picked out of this? And I want coaches then to have the courage to challenge each other and say, listen, Frank, you did this. If you do that again, it's going to cost the club points. I suggest you have a look at that again. Okay, well, what do you think I should do? And another coach might say, well, I'll tell you what, Frank, you're concentrating on the wrong thing when you're working with that high jumper. The whole essence is to get the free thigh on the move earlier, and you're not encouraging that. You're asking them to work on the jumping leg, but actually it's the free thigh that's the key to this. Little things like that you pick up over time. I think if we're going to put British athletics where it must be at the top of world athletics, we've got to learn to work together on this stuff. We really have to.
I think, Frank, that is such a poignant and important point. I can also tell that it's resonated so much with the viewers, because I'm sure you've seen the comments that have been coming through. People really feel strongly about this. Now, you've raised to me one point that a club has never asked you back. I'm going to say to you that we've had 40 minutes talking to you. I'm going to end this Instagram live now because it's been fascinating so far. But Frank, I really would love you to come back again in a few weeks' time, and we should have round two, because we're exploring so much important stuff, and I can tell that the feed is hungry for more. So if you'd accept that invitation, we'd love to have you back again and hear more.
Well, I'd love to do that. And can I say thank you very much indeed. I'm very flattered that the guys out there have tuned in. I'm pretty sure I know quite a few of you, but although I can't, my glasses are not that good. I can pick up all the messages that are going on. Yes, I'd love to do that, and maybe we can do more than another one, because there are a few bits and pieces I'd really like to go to in detail. But can I leave you with one point? Absolutely, Frank. This is a message to my fellow coaches out there. That actually was I was reminded of when I organised a sort of a virtual coaching education thing, development thing with the England rugby coaches. And we had Eddie Jones in Tokyo, Neil Craig in Melbourne. The English coaches were here, of course. I'm sitting here exactly where we are now. And I brought in a guy called Boris Verkovsky, who was the head coach for the Soleil originally, and he's still working with them. And we were having a conversation after the event, he and I, and we were talking about different approaches of coaches in former Eastern Europe. Forget all the drug stuff at the moment, put that to one side. In former Eastern Europe and the West, mainly United States, he was pointing out at that point. But when he said it, it really resonated with me. he was suggesting that there was a different level of approach when you are working on drills and working on skills. When you're I've seen it myself. I'm quite sure. I'm sure it never happens at Blackheath and Bromley, but I promise you, I've seen it around in different clubs. Where when athletes are doing the drills, they kind of get on with it on their own, and the coaches maybe are arranging things to get on with the next part of training or whatever. But the point that Boris was making is that in his world, it's when people are doing the drills, you must be meticulously careful in making sure that the drill is done the way it is supposed to be done, because there's a purpose to it. It's not just something I think, oh, let's get through my drills and so on. Each moment in the drill is practicing something. And if it's being done wrong, you're practicing the wrong thing. So we have to, as coaches, I believe, tighten down and really focus in on the drills. When it comes to skills, I was reminded when he went through this of a conversation I had a long time ago with Anatoly Bondarchuk, who came to Edinburgh for the European Athletics Coaches Conference. It was snowing. Chris Black was going to demonstrate the hammer. He swept snow off the circle. The crowd who'd come to the conference were surrounding the circle. And Bondarchuk was standing about 25 meters away. And I said through the interpreter, please ask Anatoly to come a bit closer because I can move these people, obviously. And she said back through him, or he said back through her, Frank, when you get too close, you don't see things. You have to stand back and have the rhythm of the technique first. And if the rhythm is fractured, for that athlete, not just for any other athlete, but for that athlete, if the rhythm is fractured, then you go in. And so that was fascinating to me because mostly we coaches in the West, we'd concentrate on the skills element. But there's a kind of a lie to that, because if you concentrate too tightly, you're trying to push the athlete into a model, a preconceived model. But actually, we as coaches, we know that each athlete is different. And as we spoke about a bit earlier about Michael Chang playing tennis and Pete Sampras playing tennis. Pete Sampras, 6'4", 6'5", Michael Chang, 5'8". Do we think they had the same approach to the techniques in stroke playing? I don't think so. And so that, what about Bolt compared with Michael Johnson and so on and so on?
I can see.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, for coaches now, can we have a tighter look, please, at when athletes are doing the drills and stand back a little bit more when they're doing the skills? Because I think there's something in there about controlling the controllables and building brilliant basics that will give us a better foundation to make sure that the athlete in the long term gets to where he or she has ambitions to go.
Frank, that's a fantastic takeaway for everyone to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And I can't wait to see you again. I don't know when that is, but we've got to have a lovely lunch or a dinner. But certainly also, I can't wait to get you back on here because we need round two. We need more. So, Frank, thank you so much for agreeing to join us. Take care, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, all the best.
Enjoy your Sunday. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and coming and listening. It's been great to have you. And I'll save this down so we can watch again. Thank you very much, Frank.
All the best, Nick. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody.